So it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Ben Lintner from the Department of Environmental Science here at Rutgers. This is Professor Lintner's program seminar today. So Ben is the director of the graduate program in atmospheric sciences and did his PhD at UC Berkeley in physics, and then worked for a while at UCLA before coming here to Rutgers. And his work is on tropical climate and in particular some links to ecology through tropical vegetation and forests. Ben.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out to my seminar. I guess this idea of maybe affiliating somehow with your program has kind of been something that's slowly unfolded over the last few years. We'll kind of see how it goes. So I want to share a little bit of the work that I've done today that's, I think, somewhat relevant, although I won't really address the role of vegetation per se. We'll kind of circle around the role that vegetation might play in the idea of the interaction between the land surface and the atmosphere. So before I begin, I just wanted to put this advertisement up here for any of you who are teaching undergrads. If you could maybe advertise this course that we're teaching. Lena Struhe, who's in your department, Laura Schneider, and Zina Morin and I are teaching what's called an embedded study abroad course next spring. The idea is to look at tropical environments through multiple lenses of climate change, biodiversity, land use, agriculture, and we're excited about this, although so far we only have 2 students signed up, so we'd like to see those numbers come up. I don't know, maybe you could sign up too, but primarily aimed for undergrads. So to give you an overview of my research, what I'll talk about here is one component of it, but it's kind of embedded within the broad question that I have stated there at the top, which is why does it rain, where it does, when it does, and how much it does. Parenthetically in the tropics, because I've spent a lot of time looking at the tropics, although not necessarily restricted to the tropics. And then a more specific question for today is what is the role of the land surface in controlling or modulating rainfall, climate more broadly, but rainfall specifically in the tropics. And a kind of interest in this is or to sort of put maybe some perspective on this, as it currently stands, about 40% of the world's population lives within the tropics, roughly 23 south to 23 north. But by 2060, that percentage is expected to grow to about 60%. So most of the world's population growth is happening in the tropics. And the course that I mentioned, part of the kind of challenge of tropical environments is the anthropogenic impacts that exist between human activity and the natural environment in the tropics. I kind of came about the sort of interest in the land surface was sort of a secondary thing. I was initially interested in tropical climate dynamics. And in tropical climate dynamics, at least, there's a long history of the study of the two-way interactions that exist between the ocean and the atmosphere, and what the implication of those two-way interactions are for tropical climate. And just, I think the sort of classic example of this kind of dialogue between the atmosphere and the ocean, both in terms of a physical phenomenon, but also in terms of having ocean and atmospheric scientists communicating with one another, is the phenomenon of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so, our kind of success in being able to understand from a theoretical perspective the El Nino Southern Oscillation, I think, came about because of the sort of tight interplay that the ocean and atmosphere communities have had over the last 50 or 60 years. Land, on the other hand, is a very different beast from the ocean, let alone from the atmosphere. In contrast to the ocean, the land has a small thermal inertia, so one of the reasons why the ocean is so impactful on climate is because it has a tremendous capacity to uptake heat energy. So the land, by contrast, has very little in terms of thermal inertia. Another thing is the water limitation that exists on the land surface. So the land has, this kind of pesky behavior of drying out if if that water is not replenished by rainfall and it's too hot. And then another sort of aspect is just the heterogeneous nature of the land surface. I mean, the ocean has some heterogeneity as well, but the land surface is far more heterogeneous. And you know, I also come from a place that I've spent a lot of time looking at climate model output, global climate models. Global climate models, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, at sort of our current computing capacity, you're looking at a sort of ability to resolve 100 to 200 kilometer grid scale, or 100 to 200 kilometer scales. And so just think about the amount of heterogeneity that exists over 100 kilometer pixel, if you will. And you know, our ability to kind of treat that heterogeneity, I think, is still something that's largely in its infancy. So just to kind of orient you, here's a map showing the distribution of rainfall. This is from a particular satellite, kind of combined satellite rain gauge product called GPCP. And it just gives you a sense of how rainfall is distributed around the world. As I said, I focus a lot on the tropics. The blue boxes are places where currently me or my research group members are focusing at the moment. So not all of it's in the tropics. You see the box kind of over Antarctica. That's due to my postdoc, Kyle. Kyle, though, is interested in connecting what happens over the Antarctic box to tropical latitudes. But I'll focus more on the two boxes that exist. I guess I can use the crazy pointer. The two boxes that exist over South America. Of course, the Amazon is located in South America. And then more recently over some interest in kind of Central America. I won't talk too much about that today. So I like maps, and this is a particularly interesting map that I came across some time ago, just from the late 1800s, and it's just a map showing the distribution of vegetation types around the world. And you know, as I said, I focus a lot on the tropics, which here is the kind of pink area in the middle, referred to as the zone of palms. So I always give this little quiz. I teach a class in tropical meteorology, so I give this little quiz to my students when I show them this map. And I say, here's a palm tree growing somewhere. Is it a palm tree growing in the tropics? Anyone want to guess? I think Tony Broccoli, who's in the audience, knows this. This is one of the palm trees that gets planted on the Jersey Shore over the summer to make it look more tropical. Of course, then they get trucked out when it gets too cold. So New Jersey, maybe over the summer, is a bit tropical. Here's another group of palm trees. Anyone want to hazard where they're growing? So they're actually on the southwest coast of Scotland. They might not be particularly happy palm trees growing on the southwest coast of Scotland, but because of the Gulf Current, at least stays warm enough that they can survive the climate there. So I wouldn't classify Scotland as a tropical climate, but if you're going by palm trees, maybe you would. We have this, I think, long history in climate from a climatological perspective, thinking about climates, particularly in the tropics, but not only in the tropics, in terms of their biogeographical characteristics. And these are the three examples. I've excluded arid climates here, like deserts, but the three examples of humid climates in the tropics, and they have some connection to vegetation. So in the bottom right-hand side is tropical rainforest. The little inset shows you the rainfall as a function of month of the year, and the temperature, the red line. Of course, the temperature doesn't vary much over the course of the year. The rainfall has some seasonality associated with it. There's a dry season and a wet season, but relatively speaking, it's plentiful rainfall most of the time. The other two climates are more seasonal climates. So in the upper right is the tropical savanna climate. So this is kind of characteristic of what you might see over parts of Africa. Certain regions in Central America, Mexico would have this type of climate. So they're much more seasonal, and seasonality in the tropics is largely determined by rainfall. So you can see there that the rainfall for this particular site, which is in Senegal, has a very strong summertime peak, northern hemisphere summer peak, And then outside of that time period, very little rainfall is occurring there. And the vegetation, you know, to a large extent reflects that kind of seasonal evolution. The other climate is a monsoon climate. This is, the little inset is from India. So in a similar sense, there's a very pronounced wet season, a very pronounced dry season. If you actually could see the magnitudes, the rainfall in the monsoon climate, you know, some months in the rainy season close to 1 meter of rain per month. So, you know, you can get very wet conditions, but over a very relatively brief part of the annual cycle. Of course, there are other ways of looking at climate kind of from this biogeographical perspective. What I just showed was actually from a very old scheme called the Köppen climate classification system. This is maybe a newer one, taking into account more types of biomes, so the Whittaker biome diagram, just showing you how, in terms of average precipitation and temperature on the y and x axes, how they map out in terms of where different ecosystem or biotypes or biome types are found. So in the title of my talk, I mentioned land-atmosphere interactions, so I should give you a sense about what I mean by land-atmosphere interactions, basically summarized in this nice simple diagram. Essentially, when we talk about land-atmosphere interactions, we're talking about the whole set of processes that couple or link the land surface to the atmosphere. There are many different aspects of this interaction or this set of interactions. I kind of have highlighted one here, which is probably the most common example of what people study. So think about precipitation, kind of coming from this circle. Precipitation falls on the land surface. It makes the surface wet. We measure wetness of the surface in terms of soil moisture. So if it rains, the surface gets wet, soil moisture goes up. Soil moisture in turn can be released from the land surface. I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. That release of soil moisture through evaporation, if we're talking about just a abiotic process or transpiration, if we're talking about the flux of water that goes through plants from the soil to the atmosphere, feeds into surface fluxes, or the exchange of, in this case, the LE, latent heat flux, is basically the exchange of energy that would be associated with that evaporative flux of water from the land surface. That in turn can modify the structure, the thermodynamic structure of the boundary layer, which is essentially the part of the atmosphere that rubs up against the land surface. And then the boundary layer structure couples back into, you know, things like clouds and other things, and then in turn that goes back to precipitation. So you can think about what I've just pointed out there as a loop, and we often in the land-atmosphere interactions community talk about feedback loops. So the idea that precipitation goes up, it increases soil moisture, that increases evaporation, which leads to more precipitation. That would be an example of a positive feedback process. You can also have negative feedback processes. So if you have rain that does something to the land surface that results in less precipitation falling at a subsequent time, that would be a negative feedback. That soil moisture to precipitation loop, as I said, is probably the most commonly studied interaction pathway, but you can see that there are other processes that are represented here. I haven't talked about the radiation budget, which is kind of on the right-hand side of the diagram. If you could imagine drawing many different loops that connect parts of the atmosphere to parts of the land surface. You could think about how the system, the atmosphere-land system, is sensitive to the operation of that particular pathway. So, you know, in terms of this talk, what I want to think about, although as I said, I'm kind of circling around that now, although it's something I hope to do more of in the future, is look more directly at what role vegetation plays in sort of mediating these sets of interactions. So how does vegetation affect land-atmosphere interactions? That's basically the science question. And, you know, from the previous diagram, you know, I think it's very clear that there are many different ways that interaction can come about. Here I've just listed some of the pathways. So one obvious pathway is the albedo, or the reflectivity of the surface. So if you contrast different kinds of land surfaces, they have different reflectivities. A snow-covered surface is going to be highly reflective. A dark surface is going to be less highly reflective or more absorptive. And so the fact that you have vegetation growing on the land surface, particularly when you're talking about, say, deciduous trees that might have leaves of one color during the growing season and then lose their leaves, you might even have a seasonal modulation of the albedo or the reflectivity of the land surface. A lot of what I've spent my time on is the second one there, the moisture flux. So again, the sort of net flux of moisture from the land surface to the atmosphere can come in different ways. You can have I haven't listed it here, but bare surface evaporation. You just have a puddle of water on the land surface that evaporates. But we also have moisture fluxes that involve plants, or at least plants have an effect on them, namely transpiration, which is, again, is the flux of water that comes through plants from the soil, in some cases very deep in the soil, and then ultimately leaves the plants through their leaves. I'll come back to that in a second. And then interception, the idea that, if you have a canopy or some leaf-covered surface, that leaf-covered surface can intercept rainfall before it hits the actual ground, and then you can get evaporation directly off of leaves. This, of course, is important not only in terms of the actual flux of water from the land surface to the atmosphere, but also in terms of how energy, the energy budget at the land surface is partitioned. So essentially, through radiation, incoming shortwave radiation from the sun, the land surface heats up. To balance that heating of the land surface from solar radiation, part of the response is outgoing long-wave radiation, basically the long-wave emissivity of the surface. But there are also turbulent exchanges, so-called turbulent flux exchanges of both water and energy. And the state of the land surface can determine, has an effect on how those turbulent fluxes are partitioned. The two terms are latent and sensible heating, so how the energy gets partitioned into the moisture part and the energy part. There's a physical effect, a kind of roughness effect from the presence of vegetation on the land surface. That can have implications for the development of turbulence and the coupling of turbulence to the larger scales of circulation in the atmosphere, depending on what's covering the land surface. And then, of course, we can get into things like biogeochemical cycling, some of the biogeochemical cycling of things that might be trace constituents that might be strongly radiatively interactive in the atmosphere. I also put down aerosols, so plants can produce organic compounds that can basically through chemical processes in the atmosphere form aerosols. Once you start forming aerosols, then you can get very interesting radiative effects. So there are multiple pathways through which vegetation could potentially affect how the land and the atmosphere communicate with one another. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on some examples from my previous work, again, that haven't really necessarily addressed the role of vegetation per se, but have looked at some aspects of land-atmosphere interactions where vegetation might be playing an important role. And so those examples include the idea of upstream sensitivity, or the sensitivity of rainfall to upstream conditions over the land surface, whether, given a place where it's raining, are the conditions upstream, the land surface conditions upstream, impacting that rainfall that occurs downstream. I'll show some results from some work I've done with colleagues looking at the effect of anthropogenic vegetation change, basically at very large scales, and trying to use our understanding of how the land surface vegetation has changed over time to explain or interpret regional trends in climate, both mean climate as well as the extremes of climate, and then some work that we've done on monsoons, and then kind of end off with where I think some interesting directions might go in the future. So for any of the non-ecologists or biologists in the audience, do you have an idea what the picture on the right is, looks kind of like a dragon's eye, but it's actually a stomate or a pore on the surface of a leaf. And those are very important when we're talking about the exchange between plants and the atmosphere. So stomates are openings that, from the plant's perspective, allow CO2 to flow into the plant from the outer environment, the external environment. But water also leaves plants through stomates. And so there's this tension that exists in plants. They want to have stomates that are sufficiently open to allow enough CO2 to come in to allow them to do their thing with photosynthesis. But they also face water loss through stomates. And so depending on how the conditions evolve around the plant can have an impact on how wide or how narrow those stomatal openings are. And this has important implications, which I won't really talk about, but important implications for what the future state of vegetation on the land surface will be. And then the diagram on the right-hand side, or sorry, my left, your left, is showing the dependence. This isn't quite the dependence of evaporation, but the ratio of evaporation to net radiative heating at the surface, how that depends on soil moisture, which is along the x-axis. This is a highly schematized diagram, but essentially it shows you the qualitative behavior. So at the low range of soil moisture, even with some soil moisture present, you might have very little evaporation coming off the land surface. Then over some range, kind of in the mid-range of soil moisture, there's a strong increase of this quantity evaporative fraction, or the ratio of evaporation to radiation. So strong increase with increasing soil moisture, and then a saturated regime where subsequent increase in soil moisture content doesn't increase energy. So from a climate point of view, the first regime essentially corresponds to arid or dry climates. The regime on the high soil moisture side corresponds to wet climates, and the transitional area in between is really where a lot of the interesting behavior happens. We can also talk about the controls of soil moisture on evaporation. And so in the dry and transitional regimes, we talk about evaporation being soil moisture limited, so there's plenty of energy available to drive evaporation, but if there's no water available to evaporate, you don't get any evaporation. Whereas on the right-hand side, or in the high soil moisture side, there's plenty of water at the land surface to evaporate, but because of limited energy coming in from the sun, maybe because of clouds or whatever, the amount of evaporation is constrained by energetics. So, it's interesting to think in kind of a land-atmosphere interactions context about how these different regimes, dry, transitional, wet, or soil moisture limited or energy limited, what kind of implication that has on how the interaction pathways work. So my first foray into all of this, and again, this was really done without thinking about the role of plants as it pertains to this question, but more about soil moisture itself. And that was to look at a place where we expect some sensitivity, or we had some reason to believe the precipitation should be sensitive to soil moisture, particularly in the upstream area. The area basically in this diagram looking over northeastern South America. So this part of Brazil is very dry, relatively speaking, along the Atlantic coast. And as you move into the interior of the continent, of course, you're heading into the very wet part of the Amazon. So it exists along a moisture gradient from east to west. And so what we were interested in is looking at how precipitation or rainfall along that transect, how it varies seasonally, and then how that seasonal variation in rainfall might be sensitive to what's happening upstream over the land surface. So that's basically the information that's conveyed in this figure. So what I want you to pay attention to, there's stuff on here that you don't, that's kind of irrelevant. But these two lines, the green one and the brown one, represent two simulations. This was all done within an idealized model because we were interested in looking at the processes involved. So in these two simulations that we did with this idealized model, we essentially varied the simple land surface model within the idealized climate model, which is essentially this type called a bucket hydrology model. So essentially at every land grid point, there's a bucket that exists of a certain depth. That depth is characterized by a quantity known as the field capacity. It's essentially how much water the land surface can hold before it becomes saturated. If you try to add water to the land surface beyond the saturation point, it just it runs off either as subsurface flow or ground or surface flow, surface runoff. So these two simulations in green and brown respectively compare a deeper bucket, 150 millimeter depth bucket, to a 15 millimeter depth bucket. And the behavior I want to point out is, and this, sorry, is a function of time. This is using a pentad time scale, so each increment here represents 5 days. So this is over the whole annual cycle from January 1st at the bottom to December 31st at the top. And so essentially you can see this line, which represents kind of where the edge of the strong rainfall band exists at a particular point in time. In the early part of this would be roughly July or so, the edge of the rainfall is basically right here at the coast. And then as the year progresses from that point, because of the evolution of the large scale conditions over the Atlantic, the rainfall migrates inland. So basically you get a drying of the part close to the coast until about the beginning of September or so, and then the large scale conditions start to modify, and basically the rainfall then migrates back toward the coast. But the comparison I want to point out is when we have the deeper bucket, the higher field capacity, you actually see less of this inward migration, this westward migration of the dry region over northeastern South America compared to having the smaller bucket. So what's going on here? So we did the following experiment, which is, one of the nice things about working with models is you can do lots of experiments that you can't do in the real world. And so we said, well, we think part of that seasonal variation in the rainfall is due to the upstream conditions that exist. So essentially you have these air masses in the trade winds coming off the Atlantic, passing over the continental surface. They're being modified by whatever the continental surface is doing. And so we wanted to look at the effect of upstream evaporation. So in another set of experiments, we basically said for the control experiment, how much would the rainfall change if we zeroed out all of the evaporation that happens upstream? And so essentially in this brown region is the part of the continent where we zeroed out the soil moisture. And so this air masses are basically coming in off the Atlantic. In the control experiment, they're being moistened somewhat by the surface conditions over the land surface. But in this perturbation experiment, we remove that moistening effect. And what you can see is you get a shift toward the west. Basically, the drier band or the drier region over northeastern South America expands. And so our interpretation of this is that the upstream part of the land surface is modifying the air masses that are flowing in, and that's changing where we see this setup, this kind of transition from little rainfall in the east to stronger rainfall in the west. And so the idea with this study was to really sort of identify how moistening at the land surface can have this significant impact, at least locally, on the rainfall characteristics. So now I want to turn to some more recent work, which is focusing on changes in vegetation over time and how those changes in vegetation over time have impacted climate, several aspects of climate, which I'll talk about here. So these are some maps showing the distribution of natural vegetation types in the center. So this is sort of an estimate of what vegetation would look like around the world if we didn't have human modification. Now, this in and of itself is an interesting question to ask. Humans have been modifying the land surface for many thousands of years, and so, what would exist in the absence of humans is really a research question. But just kind of making some inferences based on the climate state and the fact that, as I showed earlier, we can make these associations between mean rainfall, mean temperature, and what kind of vegetation exists there. So this isn't a particularly detailed map, it just has 5 different types of vegetation, but it's basically the starting point for the rest of the analysis. And then the 4 maps surrounding that show which vegetation types or where natural vegetation still largely exists. Of course, very few places around the world are pristine, but in some places, you can see in the interior of the Amazon, the scale here basically indicates the percentage of grid cell, and I think this is a 1.5 by 1.5 degree grid. How much of that is basically the natural vegetation? So some places you can reasonably still see what we expect it looked like before human modification. But of course, in many places around the world, pointing to New Jersey, I can hardly reach New Jersey, but New Jersey shows up basically as a white grid point. So essentially very little of the vegetation in this part of the world is what we think it was before human modification. And then the other maps show what exists there currently. So some of it is secondary vegetation. A lot of what we have in New Jersey is secondary regrowth of forests. So the primary forest got cut down, and now what we see is secondary regrowth. But of course, a lot of our modification of the land surface has been in service of agriculture and food production. So we have many places around the world where the greatest percentage, like in the upper Midwest over India, is now devoted to crops. Pasture is another type of human modified landscape for livestock production. And so in this set of experiments that we ran, this was done with my colleague Kirsten Findell at GFDL. So using a global climate model, what we did was essentially put in the natural vegetation type, at least our best guess of what the natural vegetation should be, and then ran a second experiment where we introduced the modifications to the land surface. And then we started to ask some questions about what the climate looks like as a result of introducing those changes. And so this is an example, or this plot or this map shows the change in mean temperature and mean specific humidity, basically the low level, the near surface temperature, near surface moisture fields. And the information here is kind of combined together using this color palette. So yellow represents warmer and humid. So in the presence of the land use change relative to the natural condition, yellow here would mean that the land surface is warmer and more humid. Green, cool and more humid. Purple, cool and cooler and drier, and red, warmer and drier. And so you can see over the eastern US, as a result of land surface change to vegetation type, what this model suggests is a warmer by on the order of, say, 2 degrees, and drier near surface conditions. So by introducing crops in place of the natural vegetation forests that were there before, it's resulted in this modification where the climate has become warmer and drier. That's also the story over other heavily agriculturally modified regions like Eastern Asia or Russia, over this part of China where there's been a lot of intensification of crops over the last several thousand years. That tends to be the dominant story. Some interesting things, although the modifications are introduced here over the land surface, you'll notice this very big effect. We didn't actually diagnose this for this study, but a very big effect that develops over the ocean around Greenland, maybe having to do with the deep circulation that kind of forms there. I don't know, but the point is that in where we are here in the eastern US, this is a pretty big modification, 2 degrees C warming and the drying of this amount. So how do we understand what's going on here mechanistically? So as I mentioned, the state of the land surface can have a large impact not only on the direct flux of water out of the surface, but how the energy is partitioned between different processes. And this is comparing the turbulent exchange or the sensible heat flux associated with turbulent energy exchange to the latent heat flux or the turbulent exchange of moisture. And so one of the things you notice here is over those regions that have become warmer and drier, there's been an increase in sensible heat flux. So essentially that partitioning of energy in the under the modified land surface condition favors the turbulent exchange of energy over latent heat flux, which is decreased. And basically they compensate one another. So the amount by which the sensible heat flux has increased is largely offset by the amount by which latent heat flux has decreased. You can look at other places on this map and find different stories depending on the precise nature of the changes there. On the bottom panels, it shows you some of the vegetation parameters that come out of the model. So in those heavily crop modified places over the eastern US, over Europe, over Asia, leaf area index, so basically a measure of the sort of leaf coverage per unit area, that leaf area index has actually decreased. So we've replaced the vegetation that existed there with a larger leaf area index by crops which have lower leaf area index. And then also how the gross primary productivity has changed. So we've basically decreased the gross primary productivity by replacing the natural vegetation type by crops. That's not true everywhere. This is actually where we see the tropics kind of showing a different response, where the gross primary productivity has actually increased, at least in some places. We can also see these modifications to the land surface playing out in terms of the daily evolution of temperature and humidity over the land surface. And so this is basically looking at what we call the diurnal cycle, or the daily progression of temperature and moisture over the land surface. This is from a pixel in the heavily cropped area, I think corresponding to central US, somewhere in Iowa. And essentially what it's showing you here in the black data, basically the mean diurnal cycle for July in the modified climate, so basically in the presence of the land use change in black, and then the diurnal cycle in green, which would be what you'd find, which would be more characteristic of the natural vegetation that used to exist there. And so the story here is consistent with the behavior that we saw in the mean. So the diurnal cycle is shifted more toward the warm side and toward the drier side. A contrast is over Atlantic Brazil. And again, we didn't really diagnose why this is the case, but there's been a more systematic shift of the diurnal cycle to both cooler and more humid conditions, again, as a result of modifying the vegetation. Then one final aspect of this is looking at regional modification to regional climate extremes through the land use change of vegetation. And so these maps are showing return periods, so essentially how long does it take for an anomaly of a certain magnitude to reappear. And essentially the benchmark that we're comparing this to is anomalies at particular grid points that have a 10-year return time in the control or the natural vegetation experiment. And so the way to think about the scale is if we have a red value, 1 or 2 year return time, that means an anomaly of that magnitude used to happen every 10 years at that grid point, now happens every 1 or 2 years in the presence of the modified land surface. And so what you can see, focusing again on the eastern US, is pronounced reduction in the return time in the modified land surface experiment. So just because of introducing this change over the historic past, we've essentially taken what would have been a 10-year anomaly in temperature and made it 1 or 2 years as a result of the changes that we've made. In the tropics, this was actually looking at warm and dry anomalies occurring simultaneously. In the tropics, the more interesting behavior is on the return time of hot and humid periods. And so the changes that have been introduced through land use and vegetation change have increased or made the return time of more humid and hot conditions occur more frequently. And you might have seen a study from a few years ago that was kind of talking about the Middle East and essentially talking about the combination of hot and humid conditions over the Middle East in summertime in the mean sense, making it such that in 40 or 50 years it might be deadly for humans to live there. And so that's essentially, one of the things to think about here is these are extremes. When do the extremes become so extreme that they start to threaten our basic ability to survive? So the other piece of work I want to talk about quickly here is also focusing on land use change and its impacts on rainfall, but in a more region-specific context. So this will be over South America. I just wanted to point out, many of you are, of course, familiar with the Amazon, know that the Amazon has, over the historic past, has experienced quite a bit of deforestation. Most of the deforestation in the Amazon has happened along the so-called arc of deforestation along the southern and eastern periphery. I've been to Manaus, which is up here in the central Amazon. It's pretty remote in Manaus. Basically, you either fly in or you take a boat on the Amazon. But in these places, that are closer to the population centers along the coast, of course, maybe not surprisingly, that's where you have a lot of the most intensive deforestation happening. So what we were interested in this particular context was trying to explain some behavior that's been observed. I think I didn't actually put the months on here, but this is essentially a trend in precipitation rainfall over the recent past, looking at two roughly decadal epochs, 1993 to 2006 and 79 to 92. And essentially what you find in the observations, and I think this is for the months of September, October, November, so it is a bit of a seasonal signal, but you see this increase in rainfall over the northern part of South America and a reduction in rainfall, or over the interior of the Amazon, an increase in rainfall, and kind of on the more peripheral part of the Amazon, a reduction in rainfall. And so we were interested in understanding why there's this particular spatial dipole trend in rainfall. So my colleague Jung-Yoon Lee set up some simulations. These were done with a different climate model from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the NCAR model. And we basically said, well, we can think of two reasons why you might have that trend. One is a sort of common thing, which is that sea surface temperatures have trends, and trends in rainfall oftentimes follow trends in sea surface temperature. But we also know that there's been this historic pattern of deforestation and other land use modification, and so maybe that's played a role. So Jung-Yoon set up a set of experiments. This is the control experiment where she put in both the sea surface temperature forcing and the known forcing from land use change. And as far as model experiments go, it's a pretty reasonable match between the observed behavior and the model. And then she did the experiment of isolating each of those factors separately. So if you just put in the sea surface temperature forcing, you get this response. And if you just put in the vegetation forcing, you get this response. So at least at this level, it looks like this dipole in precipitation is largely coming over this particular period, is largely coming from the sea surface temperature trends. We isolated them more specifically to the Pacific Ocean, but that at least over this part of the continent, there seems to be a particularly large role for the vegetation change. If you look at other aspects, this is a measure of the NDVI, which is a satellite product to measure, it essentially measures vegetation greenness, roughly a proxy of photosynthetic activity. So there has been a trend over the same period in NDVI with increasing NDVI over the Amazon where the rainfall has gone up, but decreasing NDVI over the peripheral part of the continent. And then in the model experiment, just kind of trying to isolate what the role of vegetation might be more specifically, Jung-Yoon computed the change in leaf area index, basically where you have that strong reduction in precipitation over the southeastern part of the continent is where there's been a strong reduction in leaf area index. So without going into too much detail here because I'm running short on time, we looked at these changes over the progression of the season, over the progression of the seasons. The big take-home message here is in this southeastern box where there seems to be this particularly large effect of the vegetation change. You see across the seasonal cycle in all of the experiments a reduction in precipitation. So both the sea surface temperature trend and the vegetation trend trends are acting to reduce rainfall. But if you normalize the rainfall reduction by the, how much is falling in a particular season, given that these are highly seasonal climates, you actually find that the biggest impact in a percentage basis is during the dry season. And this is a kind of recurrent theme, at least in the tropics, is that we, of course we're interested in how much rain falls during the wet season, but a lot of the big impacts really seem to show up during the dry season. And when you think about it from a vegetative point of view, the plants that exist there, what they really need to be able to cope with are these seasonal droughts that happen every year. And you can even see here that during the dry season there's some rain that's falling, and so if that rain goes away completely, what would happen to the plants that are there? I think that's a critical question to be able to address. Running a lot short on time, so let me actually skip through. Well, let me just highlight this one other result. This was from a related but different study where we wanted to look at, again, coming back to the idea of climate variability, how does the flux of water from the land surface affect climate variability? So in this experiment, and again, this is something you can do with models, you can't do in the real world, Jung-Yoon took the NCAR model and basically zeroed out the transpiration. So didn't allow any flux of water to occur from the land surface through plants. And so what we have here is a comparison of the climate variables simulated by the model. These are aggregates over the whole tropics. You're basically seeing the bulk effect of zeroing out the transpiration. And so not surprisingly, the evapotranspiration, basically the quantity that measures the sum of the flux of water out of the land surface, that decreases. The distribution shifts toward the drier end if transpiration is removed, not surprisingly. You can see what happens to the surface temperature. So the surface temperature PDF or distribution broadens out and the mean shifts toward the higher end of the temperature range. Interestingly, column water vapor, so how much water exists within a column of atmosphere, that tends to dry out in the mean by a little bit, but you can see that you can actually get increases in extreme wet or extreme column water vapor values. And this seems to be more related to the change in circulation of the atmosphere that comes about through basically through this severe reduction in evaporation being compensated by an increase in sensible heat flux. That increase in sensible heat flux is what drives the convergent part of the atmospheric circulation. And so under the very strong anomalous convergent conditions, you can actually get these very moist columns of air over the land surface, even though you're limiting the actual flux of moisture that's coming in from the land surface. And precipitation kind of follows that behavior. So you get in the no transpiration case an increase in events where you see much larger rain rates than what we have in the presence of the transpiration. So I didn't get to the monsoons, it's okay. Let me just finish off by, I can come back to the monsoons if anyone's interested in seeing that, but let me just finish off by talking a little bit about how I've thought maybe about moving forward in affiliating with your program. So I think an obvious place where I would like to invest some effort, and I'm certainly open to feedback on this, but putting together a graduate course in climate ecosystem interactions. I didn't mention it explicitly here, but what I'm interested in is kind of what's happening at these very large scales that are relevant to climate. And so, having a course that kind of dives into the aspects of climate scale with ecosystem scale processes would be something of interest. And then some research topics that I'm currently pursuing or hope to pursue. I spend a lot of time analyzing climate model simulations. And so one of the things, and this is some discussion I've been having with some ecologist colleagues, is how to develop evaluation systems for climate models that really take a kind of vegetation or ecosystem or biome type of approach. So one of the things we spend a lot of time doing in the study of climate models is trying to understand biases, or if we're looking at ensembles or groups of models, the spread in behavior that exists across those models. So, to what extent can we interpret or understand biases or model spread in terms of vegetation processes? I should mention that I think we're at this interesting point in our kind of modeling capacity where, we've gone beyond saying that plants are green and they transpire. A lot of the kind of cutting edge in climate modeling is enabling climate models with dynamic vegetation, having vegetation that can respond, so-called trait-based parameterization schemes that allow the vegetation to evolve over time. The way we've done it traditionally is you stick in some static vegetation field, but we're increasingly turning to dynamic, fully interactive vegetation models. And another question, a kind of more specific question that's of interest to me is, when someone is interested in a particular ecosystem or biome, what aspects of climate, what kinds of diagnostics from a climate model might such a person be interested in? One example is rainfall. I study rainfall. Rainfall has many different dimensions of variability. We can talk about the annual mean rainfall. We can talk about how it varies from year to year. In the tropics, it has a very strong seasonal cycle. Some places the seasonal cycle is an annual cycle. Other places it's semi-annual. So, over different biomes or different ecosystem types, what dimensions of rainfall really matter? And I think, by having climate folks and ecosystem ecologists interacting with one another, I think that's really what it'll take, so that we, as a climate community, are kind of producing the information that ecosystem scientists or ecologists need to inform what they're doing. Another area is the development of process-based metrics to look at land-atmosphere interactions that incorporate vegetation parameters. So I pointed out at the beginning the coupling between soil moisture and precipitation as a well-studied example. But if you look at that feedback or that interaction loop with kind of, again, a sort of vegetation or ecosystem lens, I think that's a helpful thing to do. I'm not exactly sure how to do it, but it's something I think we as a community are interested in doing. And then a final thing here, and I mention it just because I think it's really cool, is the exploration of sensitive regions where we think, or where we have some expectation maybe that vegetation states are fundamentally important. I mean, I think they're important, but that they can actually affect what type of climate we see there. And so the idea here is perhaps of bimodality or hysteresis. And just as an example, this was from a study done quite some time ago now, where they essentially took, at the time, a state-of-the-art climate model, and with coupled to an early generation dynamic vegetation model, and they ran 2 experiments. So in the first experiment shown over here, they started with the land surface completely forested. So they ran this model initialized from a completely forested land surface with dynamic vegetation, and then over time, several hundred to 1,000 years of running this model simulation, the model produced this distribution of vegetation. So basically, it started off all green. By the time it reached an equilibrium, you kind of have the forest. The forest exists where we currently see the Amazon existing. And so then they said, well, what happens if we initialize this model simulation, but we start not from a forested state, but from a completely desertified state? So desert everywhere. And what they found, there's some differences in other places, but a significant difference here over this part of the Amazon, where if the model is initialized from desert, it doesn't transition, it never transitions to forest. At best, it becomes a savanna landscape. And so this study and some work that's been done since then have kind of pointed to this particular region on the periphery of the really wet, humid part of the Amazon as being this sort of sensitive zone where it can exist either as a forested land surface state or a savanna land surface state. And if you look at the climate that exists here, the temperature and the rainfall, the moisture fields, they're very different if you're talking about a forested surface or a savanna surface. And so, I think especially as we move toward more and more sophisticated types of vegetation models coupled to climate models, I think this type of study, something I would be interested in doing, because I think you can find some interesting types of behavior here. I think another place might be the Sahel region, the Sahara, Sahel transition region over Africa, places where, because of the initialization or what initial state you prescribe in the model can have a big impact on what climate can exist there at equilibrium. So I think with that, I'll stop and take any questions you might have.
Time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Just about the example you were showing here at the end. Is fire part of that? Because I know, at least from the ecological point of view,
Right.
the sort of savanna forest transition is often talked about in terms of
Yeah, I think at the state of, 2004 level of sophistication, this was just a very simple dynamic vegetation model without fire. But I agree that, that's part, I think, that, if you redid this experiment with a more sophisticated dynamic vegetation model, fire is probably part of the story, but I don't know. One of my interests is running trying to develop very simple models that might capture this kind of bimodality. So what are the essential basic ingredients that you need to have a kind of bimodal climate like this? I think there are different ways that you can get that kind of bimodality.
And one of the things that I've seen in Mongolia where I work is that the total amount of precipitation is the same over time, but it now comes down in thunderstorms versus long rainy days, and so the impact on the vegetation is totally different.
Right.
Is that sort of thing below the scale that any of these models can get, or is it?
Well, the models will do something. Whether they're doing, I hate to say doing the right thing for the wrong reason or wrong thing for the right reason, or however you want to put it. So the models simulate, you could take a climate model like this and look at very high frequency output, but the way the models treat rainfall in particular, probably not something that's very credible if you're talking about extreme events on a daily timescale. Just because you know, as I said, these models, when I'm saying climate models here, I'm typically thinking 100 to 200 kilometer scale. And so if you're talking about convective thunderstorm, that's maybe 10 kilometer scale. And so, you know, you have a mismatch between what the models can do and what you're seeing in the observations. In a sense, I'm often surprised. I mean, it's remarkable at some level that if we're talking about seasonal timescales, you know, the monthly accumulated rainfall, the models are somehow able to capture that, but I think it's because there are different constraints that the models obey on those timescales.